Fuck it. I wanna I wanna postpone doing my schoolwork for as long as possible, so what the fuck is that noise? Why does this emulator do that? Why is it doing that now? It did it yesterday when I logged in too. It didn't do that before. How do I get rid of it?
All the hate these games receive, there can only be one who sits upon the throne of salt. Be crowned. In this video, we're not just exploring. We're exploring a phenomenon, an aberration, a creation that, intentionally or not, might never be balanced. This is the untold story of Dead by Daylight. Like League of Legends, Dota, Counter-Strike, Fortnite, and many others have all faced balancing challenges in the past. Certain characters, items, or other mechanics can be wildly overtuned and create a horrible environment for anyone playing against it. However, the one thing all of these games have going for them is that the players are all using the same fundamental rules. Dota, for example, it's two teams against each other in a race to see who can destroy the opponent's main structure, the Ancient, first. Both teams must kill other players, destroy towers, complete side objectives, and push down similar-looking lanes. Even though your heroes and roles might be different, the goal and main gameplay mechanics remain the same for everyone. This is called soft asymmetry. Strong asymmetric games are like Left 4 Dead, where one side is a group of humans shooting their way through hordes of zombies to reach a safe zone, while the opposing side is a group of zombies with powers that are hell-bent on stopping the humans from reaching said safe zone. In Dead by Daylight, you can either assume the role of a single...
I can try to
The
help.
highly anticipated work of 2020.
Oh my god. Astral Odyssey. I saw that in the home just now. I guess it's a new game. I literally got an ad right now. You guys heard it. They're using a text-to-speech voice. What the fuck?
For the next edge vertex, it also causes a floor gap. And for the last one, this one's a little weird. See,
Why is my
the bottom of the
stamina
step and the top of the step don't actually line up.
Did I not
even
log
though
in
they were meant
yesterday?
to. That's what actually causes the
I
side
did.
of that third step to be
This
a
is
floor
true.
instead of a wall, like we saw before. But anyway, this just means we have two edge vertices to look at instead of one, and they both cause floor gaps. So let's zoom out a little, and now you can see that there are integer coordinates that lie in the white area between floors, meaning that those points are out of bounds. Now let's remove the triangle fill colors so that we can mark which unit squares are out of bounds. For each of those integer coordinates, let's add the arrow facing away from the origin, and then fill in those unit squares with gray for out of bounds. And now let's pan across the seam so that we can see all of the unit squares of out of bounds. So each of the unit squares on the right represents a little sliver of out of bounds that leads through the leading wall. And as we're panning on the right, I'm adding these slivers on the left so that you can see them in 3D. They're basically square columns that are 1 unit wide, though I'm drawing them each as 1 pixel wide because that's what's easiest to see. So that's the whole seam. Interestingly, there's one point near the middle of the seam that lies on the x-axis. So that point has 2 arrows and causes 2 unit squares of invisible wall. So yeah, that's how the out-of-bounds units are distributed along the seam. On the left, if we zoom in a bit, you can see the 2 unit columns in the middle that are extra close together, since they're both from that point on the x-axis. And if we step back a little, you can see just how high up this invisible wall goes, all the way to the top
Off
of
the
course,
Eternity
at a height
Sinners
of
fucking suck to deal with.
32,768.
Like,
So
yikes.
it's pretty weird. There's just this invisible wall in the course that
I'm
goes
fine
way
with
higher
being
up
the
than
system.
anything
They're
else.
pretty much the most eccentric and non-human.
That means anytime you go through that spot, you may end up bonking on it seemingly out of nowhere. On the other
From
hand,
the list
you
of
may end
people.
up passing right through it. So why is it that you only hit it sometimes?
Like, most
Are
of
you
the
here to
sinners
see
are
me
pretty
cheat?
reasonable. There are a few crazy people like Wendy,
Wall units on a seam like this. Now normally,
but they can
wall
still
units are at a
technically be
Just
kinda
to keep this
reasoned with.
demonstration simple, we're gonna say that they're all in a nice row like this.
A psycho is still a human in the end.
Wall seam and wants to cross it going
They
north.
still have a
Now,
brain
it's
that
important
can
to
be
understand
reasoned with.
exactly how Mario's movement works. So Mario has a horizontal speed, which represents how many units forwards he moves per frame. For example, if Mario's speed is 8, then he moves 8 units forwards per frame. But even that's a bit of an oversimplification, because the game doesn't move Mario forwards all at once. Instead, Instead, it takes his speed and subdivides it into 4 equal pieces called quarter steps. So a speed of 8 would be subdivided into 4 quarter steps, each having a size of 2. Then on each frame, Mario moves forward by 4 quarter steps. So in the game, you'd see Mario before he does the 4 quarter steps, you'd see Mario after he does the 4 quarter steps, but you wouldn't see him at these intermediate positions because they happen mid-frame. But I'll still show them here because they're very relevant for this discussion. So here, I'm making full steps pink and quarter steps yellow so that it's easy to distinguish them. Earlier, when I showed movement arrows, they were kind of a mishmash between quarter steps and full steps because I was simplifying. But you see, it's only every full step that Mario's animation updates and gravity applies, while it's every quarter step that floors, walls, ceilings, and out of bounds apply. Since here, we're interested in whether Mario hits invisible wall units, which are ceilings and out of bounds, we're only going to focus on the quarter step arrows. And I'll add even more arrows to his pathing, because we're interested in whether he hits the invisible wall at any point in his pathing, not just on the next frame. Anyway, since Mario's moving forwards 2 units at a time, that covers every second unit. That means there are 2 kinds of spacings, a spacing like this, and a spacing that's offset by 1 unit like this. You can think of them as one covers the even unit squares, and one covers the odd unit squares. If we look at the invisible wall seam, you can see that the padding on the left skips straight over the seam, while the padding on the right hits it. Since invisible walls stop your movement, I'll remove all the arrows after the collision and put this symbol at the collision point. So in this example, there's a 50% chance that we hit the invisible wall, since 1 out of every 2 spacings hits it. Another way to see this is if we take just one of the spacings and move the starting point continuously. You can see that half the time it makes it through and half the time it stops. So that's why invisible walls can seem sort of random. Even though they're always there and don't move, you're not guaranteed to hit them when you cross the seam.
Different.
Instead, it just comes down to whether your spacing crosses over it or goes into it. So in theory, you could always avoid hitting them by controlling your spacing just right. But in practice, at least casually, that's way too precise to control. But luckily, there are some other factors that are easier to control that also affect how often you hit an invisible wall. For example, your speed. So far, we've just been working with a speed of 8, which has quarter steps of size 2. Well, let's double that to 16 speed, which has quarter steps of size 4. This time we have 4 different spacings, which you can think of as covering all the unit squares that are a multiple.
Why are there question marks?
1 more than a multiple of 4, 2 more than a multiple of 4, and 3 more than a multiple of 4. There wouldn't be any more than that, because like, if we added a 5th one, 4 more than a multiple of 4, then really it's just the same spacing as the first case, but starting 1 quarter step forwards. But anyway, you can see that only one of the 4 spacings hits the invisible wall, meaning that there's a 1/4 chance of hitting it. And just like before, we can also see this by taking one of the spacings and moving it continuously. Most of the time it makes it through, but 1/4 of the time it hits the invisible wall and stops. So at 8 speed, there was a 50% chance of hitting the invisible wall, and at 16 speed, there was only a 25% chance of hitting it. So basically, the faster Mario's moving, the smaller the chance of hitting the invisible wall. Because more speed means your quarter steps cover more distance, and then they're more likely to pass right over the invisible wall units. Separately, your chance of hitting the invisible wall also depends on Mario's angle to the invisible wall seam. Currently, we're moving perpendicularly to the seam, which is optimal if you're trying to avoid hitting the invisible wall. So that'll be the control case, and we'll compare it to this case of Mario turned at an angle. At this angle, each quarter step moves 3.5 units to the right and 2 units forwards. Now if you think about this, the 3.5 units to the right doesn't contribute towards crossing the seam, and so it's like that part of the movement is going to waste at this angle. It's only the 2 units forwards that makes progress towards crossing the seam. If we move both cases vertically, you can see that the angled case hits the invisible wall twice as much as the control case, since the control case moves forwards 4 units at a time, while the angled case moves forwards only 2 units at a time. So even though they're the same speed, the angle changes how much of your speed contributes towards getting past the invisible wall. Going perpendicularly uses all of the speed to try to get past the invisible wall, while a slanted angle only uses a component of the speed to try to get past it. And now watch this. If we make Mario's angle even more slanted, now he moves 3.9 units to the right and only 1 unit forwards. Since the invisible wall is 1 unit thick, that means Mario can't even cross it now. See, no matter where he starts, his quarter steps just don't move forwards enough to cross the seam. So to recap so far, if you're trying to avoid hitting an invisible wall, then you should be
I think
moving at
reticles
fast
are pretty
speed
good
and
here.
moving perpendicularly to the seam. But if you're trying to hit the invisible wall, then you should be moving at a slow speed, moving nearly parallel to the seam. But there are also properties of the invisible
Let's
wall
go,
itself that
Sydney.
affect how often you hit it. Up until now, we've just been looking at the simplest example of an invisible wall, which is a
If
one
this
unit
scene
thick
could be
continuous seam. But
reenacted,
invisible walls often
what
don't
would
look like
be
this. For example,
your
maybe we have an invisible wall that looks like this, where it's 2
execution time?
units thick. Now if we look at all the spacings, we can see that 2 of the 4 spacings hit it, which is a
I have to
50%
go.
chance. In other words, the thicker the invisible wall is, the higher the chance of hitting it. On the other hand, we might
Got to
instead have
face
something
that
more like
boring
this, where only
breathing
every
bunch
second
again.
unit on the seam is an invisible wall. Now, not only do we have 4 possible vertical spacings, but we have 2 possible horizontal spacings, because you may or may not line up with an invisible wall unit. To illustrate this, we can subdivide each of the existing cases into 2 cases. So now, we have 4 different classes of vertical spacings. 3 of them cross right over the seam, but 1 of them lands on the seam directly. Not necessarily on an invisible wall unit, but just on the seam. And separately, we have 2 different classes of horizontal spacings. 1 of them passes between the invisible wall units, while the
Rest
other
for
one lines up with an
eternity.
invisible wall unit. So in total, that's 8 possible spacings, only 1 of which hits the invisible wall. So there's a 1 in 8 chance of hitting it. Another way of saying
Rest
it
for
is, there's a 1 in 4
eternity.
chance that we land on the seam, and a 1 in 2 chance that we line up with an invisible wall unit. So multiply
Time to
those
die.
together, and you get that there's a 1 in 8 chance
You-
of hitting the
you
invisible
forced
wall.
me to do
And note
this!
that this is in comparison to before, when it was
You-
a continuous
you
seam,
forced
where
me
we
to
had a
do this!
1/4 chance of hitting it. But now that it's half as
Please,
dense, we only have
enjoy
half
the
that
tree.
chance
Hold
of hitting
them
it,
off.
which is 1/8. So basically, the denser the invisible wall is,
Rest
the higher
for
the chance of hitting
eternity.
it. And finally, many invisible walls don't even have a uniform spacing along the whole seam. For example, maybe it's more dense on the left and less dense on the right. In this case, trying to cross it on
Time
the
to
left
die.
side is more likely to hit it, and trying to cross it on the right side is less likely to hit it. So yeah, that's
Rest
the basics
for
of interacting with
eternity.
this kind of invisible wall. That should help you understand
You-
and appreciate
you
the rest of
forced
the
me to do
examples
this!
as we go through them. Now, I'm not just going to show you a few examples and call it a day. That's not how we do things here. Instead, I'm going to show you every invisible
You-
wall in the
You
game
forced me
for
to
a
do
few
this!
reasons. First, I want this video to serve as a reference guide for every invisible wall, showing where they are and what they look like. That way, the next time you bump into one, you can come back here and see exactly why it's there. And second, I want to show you just how prevalent invisible walls are, and just how glitchy
You-
this game is.
you
That
forced
way,
me to
you
do
won't feel
this!
so bad about bumping into invisible
Time
walls.
to die.
They're so abundant that you didn't really stand a chance. So, if you do want to see every example, because you want to know
Please,
every
enjoy
inch
the
of this
show.
game's weirdness,
Rest for
then you can just sit back
eternity.
and relax as I break it all down for you. And if you
Please,
don't want to watch all
enjoy
the
the show.
examples because you see some of them and get the gist of it, that's fine too. You can skip forward to the
Time
next
to
section
die.
using YouTube's chapter system. And so now, let's get into the examples. So also in Bob Battlefield, we have this wall on the bar fence. Based on how its edges are subdivided, it has 1 edge vertex on the bottom, which misses its
Rest
edge by
for
causing a
eternity.
plugin. And so that means that all along the seam are units of out of bounds. Note that the density of this invisible wall varies along the seam. There are even some gaps in it. And so basically, if you
That's
ever go
it.
above this bar fence, you may end up bonking on this invisible wall. And remember earlier when I showed that you could bonk inside a ceiling hitbox?
Is that really her victory?
Well, you can also do that with this kind of invisible wall, essentially by wedging yourself between 2 of the unit columns. Playing it again, if we pause it and zoom in, you can see exactly what's going on. So on this frame, Mario does a quarter step going forwards as part of the dive action. This quarter step lands on a unit square out of bounds, so it gets cancelled and Mario bonks.
No,
Note that
what
Mario's
is
bonking
this?
animation is 1 frame behind what it should be, so on the left it doesn't quite look like he bonked yet. I mean, you can see the star particles, but his animation is still diving. But he's bonking, so next he moves backwards a quarter step, which also lands on a unit square of out of bounds. So that gets cancelled too, and Mario reflects his angle. And now since he's still bonking, he does another quarter step backwards the other way, which also lands on a unit square of out of bounds. So that quarter step gets cancelled and causes another reflection. And now we're back to the same state as before, so it just repeats over and over. Mario just bounces back and forth between those 2 unit squares. So yeah, that's why that can happen. Then still in Bob on Battlefield, field, we have this wall on the far side of the gap in the mountain path. It has 2 edge vertices on the top. Interestingly, the left edge vertex causes a floor overlap, so that's fine. But the edge vertex on the right causes a floor gap, which is where the problem is. So near that right edge vertex, we have some unit columns of out of bounds, specifically 2 groups of them. Now this invisible wall is especially evil because if you hit it, you fall into the gap. Like, I can't imagine a worse place in Bob on Battlefield to have an invisible wall than on the far side of the gap you have to jump over. Then even still in Bob on Battlefield, we have this wall right after the bridge on the mountain path. It's kind of a weird shape, but it has 1 edge vertex on the top near the bridge. This edge vertex misses its edge by causing a floor gap, which means that there are some unit columns of out of bounds near the bridge. And interestingly, if we zoom in on the bridge, you can see that some of the unit columns actually rise up into the bridge, and so they stop there instead of continuing to rise up. But anyway, that means that for this gap too, if you try to jump over it, you may end up hitting this invisible wall and falling into the gap. And one more in Bob on Battlefield, we have this wall below the upper alcove in the mountain. It has 2 edge vertices. Zooming in, we can see that the right one causes a floor overlap, and the left one causes a floor gap. So the result is that mainly on the left side of the alcove, we have some unit columns of out of bounds, and these ones are fully contained within the alcove. So this means anytime you enter or exit this alcove, you might bonk on this invisible wall. Then in Jolly Roger Bay, we have this wall on the right side of this alcove. That's 1 edge vertex on the top. Will there be a floor overlap or a floor gap? It's a floor gap. I mean, it has to be. Otherwise, why would we be here examining it? Now, a cool thing about this one is that it only has 4 unit columns of out of bounds, so you can see each one of them individually. And since this one's in water, we can swim into it, which cancels our movement, and so we just end up swimming in place. So it looks pretty odd. Then in the Jolly Roger Bay ship, we've got a lot going on. So first, there's the slowest platform that has a wall with an edge vertex, and so it has an invisible wall on its edge. Then next, we have this slightly higher platform. Very similar thing going on here, because the bottom of this wall has an edge vertex leading to another invisible wall. Then on one of the higher platforms, we have yet another wall with an edge vertex that causes an invisible wall. So that makes 3 platforms with invisible walls, but can we get a 4th one? And yes, we can, on the highest platform of them all. This time, the wall's a slightly different shape, and there are only 3 unit columns of out of bounds. So yeah, those are the 4 platforms with this type of invisible wall. So if you thought climbing up these platforms was hard on its own, just remember that out of nowhere you might bonk on one of these invisible walls. But hey, at least now you know where they are, so you can avoid them. Or hit them on purpose if that's what you're into. I'm not going to judge. And in Cool Mountain, we have this wall. It's like an upside down triangle, so it has 1 edge vertex on the bottom. Now if we show all the floors except the death barrier, you can see that there are some floor gaps. But this time, they're filled with ceiling instead of out of bounds. Because if we look on the bottom of the structure, we can see the ceiling down here whose upper hitbox leads through those floor gaps. So what that means is that all along the seam, there are unit columns of ceiling leading through. Now as a general rule, in courses with death barriers, all the invisible walls coming out of floor gaps will be due to ceilings and not out of bounds. Because think about it, if the course has a death barrier, then the whole thing is protected from out of bounds. That means you wouldn't find out of bounds anywhere in the main part of the course. And it's not like the course geometry can generate its own out of bounds. That's not how that works. Here's another way to think about it. Let's say we have a floor and it has a floor gap in it. In order for this floor gap to have out of bounds under it, there would have to be no floor under it, because that's what out of bounds means. But even if the main part of the course doesn't have any floors under it, death barrier is still guaranteed to be a floor under it. So it's just not possible to have out of bounds come out of the floor gap. Instead, the only way for there to be an invisible wall coming out of the floor gap would be if there's a ceiling hitbox leading through it, because courses can generate their own ceiling hitboxes. Now let me clarify how jumping into ceiling columns works. Basically, there are 3 cases. Case 1, you move into the ceiling column while falling down. In this case, your quarter step gets cancelled and you bonk, assuming you're moving fast enough. Then case 2, you move into the ceiling column while moving upwards. Then your quarter step gets cancelled and the ceiling cuts short your upwards trajectory, meaning you'll now start falling down. But then let's say you miss the ceiling column on the next frame, either because your speed changed or you're holding a slightly different angle on the control stick. Then you'll pass right through the invisible wall and continue with your trajectory, though it'll now be moving downwards. And then case 3, you move into the ceiling column while moving upwards, so your quarter step gets cancelled, and it cuts short your upwards trajectory. And then you hit the ceiling column again on the next frame with your downwards trajectory. Then just like the first case, your quarter step gets cancelled and you bonk, assuming you're moving faster. So it kind of looks like you went straight from moving upwards to bonking, but it was actually a 2-frame process because of the way ceilings work. So yeah, those are the 3 main interactions that can happen when you jump into a seam of ceiling hitbox. So going back to the game, let me show you what these interactions look like. So first I hit the ceiling while moving downwards, which causes me to bonk. Next I hit it while moving upwards and then miss it afterwards, so it cuts short my triple jump. And then I hit it 2 frames in a row, so it looks like it goes straight from moving upwards to bonking, but it actually took 2 frames. And like I mentioned earlier, an easy way to confirm that this invisible wall is a ceiling is to just walk into it and then try jumping. You can see that my jumps don't go anywhere, meaning it's a ceiling. On the other hand, if we push against an invisible wall that's out of bounds and then try jumping, the jumps actually go up. And next to Cool Mountain, we have this wall. It's a pretty interesting shape. This is like a little overhang structure on the right, and here are the relevant edge vertices. So the first one misses by causing a floor gap, then a floor overlap. Now let's zoom out and hide some of the lower floors to make this next part easier to see. So then we have a floor overlap, and the last one is a floor gap. And based on our earlier discussion, you should already know that these ones are going to be ceiling leaking through and not out of bounds, since Cool Mountain has a depth barrier. Now you can see that there are 2 sections of invisible wall. The section on the left is due to this ceiling on the underside of the wood, and the section on the right is due to this ceiling on the underside of the overhang. So these invisible walls could get in your way if you're doing movement near the red coin star. And remember, the bridge flap invisible wall is around here too, so surely there wouldn't be a third one around here, right? Well, also in Cool Mountain, there's this wall right next door to the previous one we looked at. Now this wall is actually made up of 2 floors, 2 ceilings, and 2 walls. And it's the big wall on the left that's the issue. It's another triangle, so it has 1 edge vertex on the bottom. This edge vertex misses the edge by causing a floor gap, resulting in 2 sections of invisible wall. The section on the right is due to this ceiling triangle that we've been looking at the whole time, and the section on the left is due to this ceiling down here, you know, the top of the little cave. And so basically, if you're messing around near the blue coins, you might just bump into this invisible wall. Now this invisible wall is interesting because it's actually used in the task for collecting 100 coins while doing the big penguin race, which was tasked by Crackheads. See, she uses the invisible wall to backwards long jump in order to get lots of speed. That makes for a quick trip back up the mountain to enter the cabin for the penguin race. Now I've talked about backwards long jumping a couple times, but I haven't really explained it, so let me do that now. So Mario has a move called a long jump you can do by pressing C and then A while you're moving. Now the cool thing about a long jump is that when you start it multiplies your speed by 1.5. Let me show this on the graph. If we start with 1 speed and continuously long jump, our speed increases by more and more each time, because each time it multiplies by 1.5, or in other words, gets 50% bigger. Now the programmers didn't want you to be able to get infinite speed this way, so they capped it at a maximum of 48 speed. So a long jump will never go above 48 speed. But the programmers made a little oversight because they forgot about the negative numbers. So let's say we start with -1 speed. Now if we start continuously long jumping, our speed will decrease by more and more, since multiplying by 1.5 just makes these negative numbers more negative. And this time there's no cap. The programmers never put a minimum speed that a long jumping can do, so basically we can get unlimited negative speed by long jumping backwards. And so we call it a backwards long jump, or DLJ. Now, doing backwards long jumps doesn't automatically result in unlimited negative speed. That's because even though the starting speed of a long jump is uncapped, Mario loses speed while he's in the air from the long jump. So trying to backwards long jump on a flat floor with nothing else won't work, because Mario loses too much speed in the air. Looking at the speed value, you can see that I get to -20 speed right after starting a long jump, but then it goes back to -15 by the time I land and can do the next long jump. To avoid losing all the speed, you need to do a bunch of backwards long jumps in quick succession. So you can do this on a steep floor, because then each long jump lands back on the floor instantly, and so you can do a bunch of long jumps in a row without any air time. You can also do it on a rising platform, because the platform rises into your jump, so you land instantly and can then backwards long jump again. And finally, you can do it using using a ceiling because the ceiling makes you land instantly instead of letting you jump up. See, it's all coming together. So going back to the full mountain task, let's pause it, zoom in, and now I'll show Mario's movement arrows. And I'll make the arrows green if they're on the first frame of a long jump. So you can see that each backwards long jump was strategically done to move into a ceiling column, which prevents Mario from jumping up and instead makes him land right after. That allows Mario to do the next backwards long jump right away, and so he's able to build up speed very quickly by doing that. So see, invisible walls can actually be helpful for something. Then in Big Boot's Haunt, we have this wall on a seam between floors. Now you might be wondering what floor the magenta line belongs to. Well, there are actually some invisible, intangible floor triangles in this room covering the giant gap in the floor. So why are they there? Well, you see, when Mario's in a course with rooms, like Big Boot's Haunt, then only one or two rooms are active at a time. Specifically, the game activates the room that Mario's in and any room that he's next to the door of. And the way the game figures out which rooms to activate is based on the floor triangle that Mario's above. So to put it simply, if Mario's above a floor in room A, then room A will be active. If he's above a floor in room B, then room B will be active. And if he's above a floor in room floor, usually next to a door, then both room A and room B will be active. Now the system works pretty well, but think about how it would work in this room. The thing about this room is that there's a big gap in the floor that leads to the room down below.
I'll count on you,
Since
guys.
Mario's current room is based on which floor he's above, in theory, that would mean jumping over the gap would change your room to the room down below. That'd be bad, because then the room down below would be active instead of the upper room, even though you're still in that upper room. So to solve this, the programmers did two things. First, they added some invisible, intangible floors here that belong to this upper room. That way, even if you're above the gap, your floor triangle is still a floor from this upper room, and so the upper room stays active. And second, a bit lower down, they added a second layer of invisible, intangible floors. These floors are intermediate floors, meaning they activate both the upper room and lower room. So when Mario falls into the gap, first the upper room is active, then both the upper room and lower room are active, and then only the lower room is active. So yeah, that's why these floors are here. And now let's resume the visual, which reveals that there are floor gaps. But this time, it's not ceiling or out of bounds that's below the floor gaps. Remember earlier, I said there were 3 cases for floor gaps. So far, we've only seen case 2, which is out of bounds, and case 3, which is a ceiling. But now, it's our first time seeing case 1, where there's a floor gap with a floor under it. So it's not actually an invisible wall, though it does stem from the same cause. So in our demonstration, that means each of these floor gaps has a floor under it, so I'll put blue points to represent them. And remember, these are floor gaps in the upper intangible floor. So when Mario goes above these floor gaps, his new floor is the lower intangible floor. So doing that causes the lower room to also activate and hides the objects in the upper room, like the Boo and Red Coin. So that's why out of nowhere, the Boo can just teleport back to its starting position while you're in this room. And finally, since it's a floor gap with a floor under it, we can just jump into it and fall down to the room below.
What?
The grand
Did anyone just see that?
Then in Hazy Maze Cave, we have this mesh ceiling that you're supposed to swing across. If you're not familiar with it, there's this path on the right that's just a dead end. There's this path in the middle that leads to an item block with a 1-up in it, and there's this path on the left that leads to the start. Now this one isn't actually an invisible wall, and it's not even a floor gap, it's a ceiling gap. Because remember, all the properties about floor detection also apply to ceilings, so they can have edge vertices that cause gaps too. And the reason these ceiling gaps matter is because if you're swinging across the mesh and move into a ceiling gap, then you fall off the mesh. So anyway, on this mesh structure, we have these 4 edge vertices that lie on this edge, we have this edge vertex that lies on this edge, and we have this edge vertex that lies on this edge. So first, let's look at the seam on the dead end path. Its edge vertex causes a ceiling overlap, which means that there's no problem here. So there's no risk of falling off if you explore the dead end. Then next, let's look at the seam at the start of the 1-up path. This one has 2 edge vertices. The right one causes a ceiling overlap, and the left one also causes a ceiling overlap. So this seam is also fine. Now let's look at the seam near the end of the 1-up path. Its edge vertex misses by causing a ceiling gap, meaning that there are ceiling gaps all along the seam. and I'm making them orange because we need a new color for ceiling gaps, and I'm kind of running out of colors.
Don't blink.
Then next, let's look at the
A
seam
mere
at the start of the starter pack.
Don't blink.
Just one edge vertex,
Don't
which misses by
blink.
causing a ceiling gap.
A mere
So on this seam
moment,
too,
let
there are
the
ceiling
dance
gaps that can make
begin.
you fall off. Not very good, since this is the path to the start. Like
The
the
show's
one path you
about
have
to
to take.
start.
And finally, let's look at the seam near the end of the star path. Just one edge vertex again, and this one also causes a ceiling gap, which is extra not good, because that means the path to the star has two seams of ceiling
Don't
gaps,
blink.
which like I said, can make you fall off out of nowhere.
show's
So in
about
total,
to
the mesh has
start.
3
The
seams of
show's
ceiling
about
gaps,
to
one on the path
start.
to the one up, and 2 on the path to the star. You know, this whole thing kind of feels like one of those carnival games that's secretly rigged against you. Like, they let you practice your swinging skills on the dead ends to let you get the hang of it and build up your confidence. Because there's no risk of falling off there. That one's perfectly safe. So then you try testing your skill on the one-up path. There are no ceiling gaps near the beginning of it because they want to make you think you have a chance. But then right at the end is the trap to make you fall off. Here I hit a ceiling gap and fall down, but luckily I still land on the platform. And finally,
Don't blink.
if you want to go for the big prize, the
Don't
starter,
blink.
well now it's double rigged against
mere
you.
moment.
These first
Step
ceiling
up.
gaps
The
are less
show's
dense on the
about
right
to
side, so
start.
that's the safer side to go on. And the second group of ceiling gaps is less dense on the left side, so that's what I recommend there. Though here, I still end up hitting it and falling down, which could easily lead to your death if you're not expecting it. And also, because these are ceiling gaps, that means it's possible to just
they don't
jump
have-
right up into the gap, because the ceiling doesn't block you there. Here's what jumping into the gap
Don't
looks
blink.
like in the game. And just for good measure, I bonk in there to show that I'm surrounded by ceiling hitbox. Then in Lethal Lava Land, we have this arched platform. Its shape is like a breeding ground for edge vertices. Look at it, it's 7 of them. So let's see, we have a floor overlap, floor overlap, floor overlap, floor overlap, floor gap, floor gap, floor gap. So mainly on the right side, we have a bunch of unit columns of out of bounds that leak out. But we can't forget about the other side of the structure, because on this side, we have something very similar
Don't
going
blink.
on. 7 edge vertices. Looking at these ones,
Quiet.
we have a floor overlap,
Don't blink.
floor overlap, floor overlap, floor overlap, floor gap,
Quiet.
floor gap, floor gap. So it's actually the same pattern on this side that was on the other side. But yeah, be careful if you're on this structure. And when Mario does a lava boost, he's able to reflect off of out of bounds, which means we can wedge Mario between unit columns and make it reflect every frame, just like earlier with the lava. Then in the volcano and Lethal Lava Land, we have these blur triangles near the lava fall, which have an edge vertex between them. So this is a rare case when it involves a seam between floors without there being a wall on the seam, but we can analyze it just the same and see that the edge vertex causes a floor gap. So there's not even a wall over the floor gap this time, there's just nothing there. And that's why we get unit columns of out of bounds, which extend all the way up to near this upper path. So if you try to take a shortcut by jumping over the gap, you could just end up bonking on this invisible wall and falling down. And the cool thing about this one is that it's actually used to the A button challenge, you know, where your goal is to not press A. See, bouncing off the invisible wall helps you
See?
redirect your momentum.
Well,
still a
God damn it.
professional.
Boosts up the lava fall, which lets you get all the way over to the star platform without having to press A at all. Then in Dire Docks, we have this wall near the 5
I'm not
yellow
about to
points.
try again.
Based on the edges, it doesn't look like there should be any edge vertices here.
For the other
it just looks like
stages.
2 edges that should laterally align. But what you don't see is that the floor on the bottom is bigger than you think and extends behind the wall. So really, the bottom edge looks like this, which means we have 2 edge vertices on the top. Now this one's weird because the edges are not at a weird angle, they're cardinally aligned, which means that it was completely doable to put these edge vertices exactly on the edge. But for whatever reason, they miss. And so we end up with a 2-unit thick continuous seam of invisible wall, which makes this one pretty egregious. Like, if you cross over this seam, you're very likely to hit this invisible wall, compared to the other ones we've seen whose units are more scattered. So you might bonk on it, you might try to jump up from the water onto the ledge and only manage the ledge
Debugging
grab.
completed.
You might try to run off this
I
ledge
can
and
go
end up
even
ledge
further
grabbing
now.
instead, because walking into an invisible wall
Debugging
slows down your
completed.
speed, and walking near a
I
ledge
can
with
go
too
even
little
further
speed
now.
makes you drop down into a ledge grab instead of just walking off the edge. Then in Snowman's Land, we have this wall. The top of the wall is subdivided into 2 different edges, so we have an edge
completed.
vertex between them. and an edge vertex causes an invisible wall. And you can see that some of these unit columns only rise upwards until they meet the icy bridge. But anyway, I guess this invisible wall could actually help you if you were about to accidentally jump off, because then it could bonk you back on. Then another in Snowman's Land, we have this wall near the igloo, though two of these triangles are actually ceilings. So here are the edges, and here are the relevant edge vertices. Zooming in on them, we have a floor overlap on the left, and on the right, the vertices miss in a way that causes a floor gap, but just a little one with exactly 2 columns of out of bounds. And you can see that these columns only rise upwards until they meet the icy bridge. So it seems unlikely that anyone's ever hit these ones before, since there's just 2 of them and they're in such a weird spot next to this green wall. Also in Snowman's Land, we have these floor triangles on the snowman's head. Once again, this is a seam between floors with no wall in it, and the floors have an edge vertex that causes a floor gap. But do these floor gaps let through out of bounds or a ceiling? Well, why not both? See, farther down on the snowman, there's a ceiling that covers some of the floor gaps, but not all of them. So floor gaps to the northwest let out of bounds leak through, and floor gaps to the southeast let ceiling leak through. So it's like a hybrid invisible wall, half out of bounds, half ceiling, but 100% trouble, because one bonk on this could send you falling all the way down the snowman, and I mean all the way down. Then still in Snowman's Land, we have this wall near the moving snow mounds. It has 2 edge vertices on top because the wall is a trapezoid. The left edge vertex does a floor overlap, which is fine, but the right edge vertex does a floor gap, which is the problem. So all along the seam, there are unit columns of out of bounds. So if you're playing around near the snow mounds, you might just bump into this invisible wall. Now there's something very interesting about this invisible wall, which has to do with the snow mounds. If we look at it from the side and take a sort of cross-section, you can see that each of the snow mounds actually drops down into the ground and covers the invisible wall for a split second before disappearing, and the extra big snow mound covers it a lot. So this is the only invisible wall where unit columns of out of bounds continuously appear and disappear. And because of that, we can actually have the out of bounds appear into Mario, causing him to die. You get it? Like normally, out of bounds prevents you from going into it, but we can go there when the out of bounds is gone, and then it reappears into us. So basically, you can just die out of nowhere. And I should mention, if you go back into bounds, you can move around some more, but the depth transition already started, and so it'll still take you out of the level. Now you have to wonder, did anyone ever die like this in the history of the game? Surely it would take like 1,000 years before this ever happened to someone by chance, right? Well, wonder no more, because it did happen to a guy named Bebop Bandit live on stream. So let's watch.
Yeah, of course I do. Please! Please! For the love of God! What the? Kidding me? What the?
So it just goes to show, when you have so many people playing the game for so many years, crazy rare stuff will happen eventually. And finally in Snowman's Land, we have this wall belonging to the green slope. You know the drill, there's an edge vertex, it misses by causing a floor gap, and so there's unit columns of out of bounds all along the seam. Now you might think this one wouldn't be too bad, because who goes on that green slope? But actually, speedrunners climb over it as a shortcut, so it could definitely cause them to bonk and mess up their run, because now you're sliding all the way down into the water. Then near the top of Tall Mountain, we have this little sliver of a wall. It has 1 edge vertex on the bottom, and if we look closely at it, we can see that it causes floor gaps. And these are the kind of floor gaps with a floor under them, because the death barrier is below them. And so interestingly, we can actually just jump right into one of these floor gaps and go through the mountain, falling all the way down to the death barrier. And these floor gaps are actually used in the A button challenge. See, Mario's able to dive up that seam using the floor gaps, because the floor gap makes him become airborne, which lets him dive again even though he's on a steep floor. And diving straight up the seam is the fastest way to get to the star on top of the mountain. Then in Rainbow Ride, we have this wall on the ship. This one also doesn't look like it should have any edge vertices. It just looks like 2 edges that laterally align. But if we look at the surface triangle view, you can see that there are multiple floors here. And that's because the floors on the right trigger wind, like most of the ship does, whereas the floors on the left don't trigger wind, probably to let you get up to the star more easily. So because of that extra subdivision of triangles, now we have an edge vertex on the bottom. That edge vertex causes a floor gap, so some unit
What does
columns
this
of
mean?
ceiling leak through, specifically
I want
from a
money.
ceiling on the bottom of the ship. So I don't know how often you're going to go right there, but if you do, you can hit this invisible wall. And in the castle grounds, we have this wall above the steps in the moat. As you'll come to learn, steps are super prone to invisible walls, since each step adds another edge vertex. This one has two, so let's see. The left one causes a little gap, and the right one causes a huge gap. It's off by 6 units. It's like they weren't even trying to align it. So the result of this is that we get an extra thick invisible wall, at least compared to the other ones we've seen so far. So yeah, you might hit this one if you try jumping into the moat, and good luck if you line up with the extra thick section. And also in the castle grounds, we have this wall near the bridge. Like I said, having steps is likely to cause invisible walls, and this is no exception. So this side of the bridge has some invisible walls. But there's also the other side of the bridge, which also has a wall above these steps. That also causes a bunch of edge vertices, some of which cause floor gaps to the right of the bridge. So on this side too, there are unit columns of out of bounds. So if you ever want to go from one side of the bridge to the other, maybe just walk on the bridge instead of jumping across the corners. You'll thank me later. And then inside the castle, we have the wall above the stairs down to the basement. With this many steps, we have more edge vertices than I know what to do with. Some cause gaps, some cause overlaps, you get the idea. You know, some part of me was like, there can't be invisible walls inside the castle. Like, this is the hub area, our safe haven. But nope, even the hub area can have invisible walls, especially with how many steps there are in the castle. Well, most of the castle steps are cardinally aligned, so they don't have any issues. But the sides of these steps are at a weird angle, which is the problem. So yeah, on both sides of these stairs, there are invisible walls that could get in your way. So watch out for them, folks. Now remember, if you jump up into a ceiling, it cuts short your upwards trajectory and then you fall down. Also remember, if you jump up into out of bounds, the horizontal component of your quarter steps gets cancelled, but you still move vertically. Interestingly, the programmers made an oversight because they never considered what should happen if these pieces occur together. And so, if you jump up into out of bounds with the ceiling above you, the out of bounds cancels the horizontal component of your movement and you still move vertically, completely ignoring the ceiling. In other words, the ceiling has no effect. You can just go straight up into the ceiling hitbox. Now this invisible wall is made of out of bounds and it extends up into the ceiling. So here, if we jump up into the invisible wall, it lets us pass straight through the ceiling, putting us next to the upstairs key door. This trick was actually used in the 120 star task, since it's the fastest way to go from the courtyard to upstairs. And the last example, in the Snowman's Land room, we have yet another staircase whose sides are at an angle. So lots of edge vertices, and some of them cause floor gaps. And so the result is that we get some unit columns of out of bounds. Not too many, just 8 of them, so watch out for those when you're making your way through this room. So yeah, that's the 4th cause of invisible walls, which we're going to call floor gap due to misaligned edge vertex. And so now, let's look at the 5th cause. So remember that structure we had before, where it was just 2 steps? Let's look at it from above again. Remember, when this structure rotated, the 2 floor edges making up the seam stayed perfectly flush with no gaps between them. But now focus your attention on this vertex of the upper step. If we move this vertex to a slightly different spot, then the 2 floor edges aren't flush anymore. There's a gap between them. And if we do our little process, we can see that there are now floor gaps which could cause invisible walls. And geometry like this happens in the game. There are vertices that are meant to be aligned, but for whatever reason, they're a bit off. You know how the previous cause of invisible walls stemmed from a misaligned edge vertex? That one was at least understandable because the edge vertex had to have integer coordinates so it couldn't be placed exactly on the edge. But in this new case, there's really no excuse. The programmers literally just didn't line up 2 floor vertices that could have easily been lined up, causing there to be floor gaps. So let's look at some examples.
Damn it.
In Cool Mountain,
Damn it.
this wall near the beginning. Here's the
Sunk
floor
cost fallacy.
edges, and we're going to focus on this vertex. So let's go to a top-down view, show the floors, and now zoom in. The vertex I highlighted should have been lined up with this other vertex, but instead of exactly coinciding, we have 2 vertices that are 1 unit apart. And all because the programmers didn't line them up right. So because of that, we have some gaps along the seam. And it's not a ceiling or out of bounds that's below these
Finally,
floor
a
gaps,
good
but
one.
another floor, specifically the death barrier. So the result of this is that
Wait,
we're able
what?
to get into these floor
Crash can summon?
We do it at the corner where the wall is too small to push us away. And by going through this gap, we don't necessarily die, we can actually land all the way down here. That's why this technique is used in the 120 star tasks, because it's the fastest way to get to the wall cakes will work star. Then in Shifting Sandland, we have these two floors in the quicksand, which presumably share a vertex over here. But if we zoom in, we can see that their vertices are actually 5 units apart. That means all along the seam between those two triangles, there are unit columns of out of bounds. Not very good, because if you're riding the shell over that seam, then there's a chance your shell might break out of nowhere and you'll die. Invisawalled? And it could also mess up your flying, because if you fly into out of bounds, your angle gets redirected downwards. So you might be flying along and suddenly you're redirected downwards into the quicksand.
Worth it.
Then in Wet Dry World, we have this wall that lies on the seam between floors. If we focus
Although
on the
I
lower
really
right
should be getting
vertex, we can
upgrades.
see that it misses the upper right vertex by 1 unit. So all along the seam, there are units of out of bounds that leak out. And so when you're collecting that ring of 8 coins, you might accidentally bonk on this invisible wall. Then in Tall Tall Mountain, we have this wall near the rolling log. We're going to focus on this vertex on the right, but also there's an edge vertex on the left that we should also look at. So if we zoom in on them, we can see that the edge vertex misses by causing a floor gap, and for the other vertex we highlighted, it's off by where it should be by 1 unit. So all along the seam, unit columns of ceiling leak out from the ceiling on the underside of the structure. And hey, this is the invisible wall that I showed in the intro. Remember that? You were so innocent back then. You had no idea how deep this rabbit hole went. Then still in Tall Tall Mountain, we have this wall triangle. Note that the triangle next to it is actually a floor and not a wall. And now we're going to focus on this vertex. Zooming in on it, we can see that it's off by 1 unit, which means that all along the theme, there are floor gaps with floor under them, because the depth barrier is below here. And so it's actually possible to just fall right through one of those floor gaps and fall to the depth barrier. Now this was the last main example of floor gaps with floor under them, aka the kind of floor gaps you can just jump into. But there are a few other examples that aren't as interesting because you can't jump all the way into them. But they're still worth mentioning, so let's briefly go through them. In Cool Cool Mountain, there are some floor gaps at the start of this bridge, so whenever you walk over this seam, you could enter freefall for a split second if your movement happens to line up with a floor gap. And if you try to fall into one of these floor gaps,
they're
the
both
wall
the
pushes
same.
you out before you're all the way through. Also in Cool Cool Mountain, there are some floor gaps in the Wall Cakes Will Work area at the start of this icy bridge. If you try to enter these, you get pushed to the side by the walls. In Snowman's Land, there are some floor gaps right where this walkway connects to the bully platform. If you try to enter these, you get pushed to the side by the wall. And in Tall Tall Mountain, there are some floor gaps right near the Monty Moles. Like the others, if you try to enter these, you get pushed to the side by the wall. So yeah, I just wanted to point those out. And now back to the real examples. Lastly, in the castle grounds, we have these 2 walls near the waterfall. So this one's like a 2-for-1 special, because this vertex misses by a bit, and this vertex also misses by a bit. So all along the seam of both of these walls, we have unit columns of out of bounds that leak through. So if you want to be like Yoshi and jump into the waterfall, you'll have to hope you miss these invisible walls. So that's the 5th cause of invisible walls, which we're going to call floor gap due to misaligned vertices. And with that, it means we've done the left side of the Punnett square, which focused on floor edges failing to line up. Next we're going to do the right side, which focuses on a floor edge and a ceiling edge failing to line up. You might get some deja vu as I explain it, because we're going to be going through a similar process to what we did before, but everything will be a little different. So, let's look at the 6th cause. So consider a box, just a regular old box. On the top there's a floor, on the bottom there's a ceiling, and on the sides there are walls. Now we're going to look at it from above on the unit grid. This time, I'm going to draw the floor from the top of the box and the ceiling from the bottom of the box. Right now, the 2 rectangles exactly coincide, so it just looks purple. But I assure you, both a floor rectangle and a ceiling rectangle are being drawn. So this time, we're going to focus on the floor rectangle's south edge and the ceiling rectangle's south edge. edge. Or in other words, the edge at the top of the wall versus the edge at the bottom of the wall. The question we're going to be analyzing is, do these two edges line up or does one jut out more than the other? On the unit grid, we can see that these two edges have the same lateral coordinates, so they do line up. Now if we see any red area, then we know the ceiling is jutting out more. And if we see any blue area, then we know the floor is jutting out more. But if all we see is purple, then we know the floor edge and ceiling edge are exactly aligned. So let's put the structure back to a top-down view. Now let's rotate it. Still, the floor edge and the ceiling edge stay exactly in sync, so neither one juts out more. See, the two edges exactly match in terms of their lateral coordinates. So let's rotate the structure back to normal, and now we're going to modify it. Now it's 2 steps going to the right, and you can see this change reflected on the unit grid, because now the floor is subdivided into 2 rectangles, while the ceiling is still just 1 rectangle. And if you notice, the floor now has 2 edge vertices, because these vertices are meant to lie exactly on the ceiling edges below. Now since the whole structure is cardinally aligned, it's easy for the edge vertices to lie exactly on their edges, and so no ceiling leaks through. On the 3D structure on the left, that means that this vertex exactly lines up with this edge. So let's clear all of that, put the structure back to a top-down view, and now let's rotate it again. You can see that now we run into the same issue from earlier because we have edge vertices at weird angles. For example, let's stop it here. At this angle, it's impossible for the edge vertex to lie in its edge, because the edge vertex has to be at integer coordinates, but the edge doesn't go through any integer coordinates. And so the edge vertex just has to pick integer coordinates that are close to the edge. In this case, the result is that the ceiling edge juts out a bit from the floor edge, because we can see some red area. Now
Why
if
is
the edge
summoning
vertex were here
modesty?
instead, then the floor would be jutting out because we can see some blue area. That would be fine since it means the floor covers the entire ceiling and some extra. In fact, that's what's happening on the other side of the structure. But since the edge vertex is here, now we have an issue because the ceiling juts out, which lets some ceiling leak through. To see this, we can do our little process. So first, we'll mark each integer point as either floor or ceiling. If it's both floor and ceiling, then I'm coloring it purple. Then add the arrows, and then fill in the unit squares. And so we can see that some of the unit squares are ceiling with no floor to cover them. Consequently, those ceiling units leak through the leaning wall and cause invisible walls. And so, any structure that resembles this structure could have the same problem. The floor could have the edge vertex, the ceiling could have the edge vertex, they could both have leak vertices. In fact, the structure could even look like this, or like this, or like this. Basically, it'll be a structure where on top there's a floor, on the bottom there's a ceiling, and on the side there are walls. Then you need the floor edges at the top of the wall and the ceiling edges at the bottom of the wall to be subdivided differently. That causes there to be edge vertices, which are intended to line up with an edge. But if the structure is at a weird angle, then the edge vertex might be misaligned from its edge, allowing some ceiling to leak through. So to recap, we looked at 4 scenarios, whether there was no edge vertex or there was an edge vertex, and whether the structure was cardinally aligned or at a weird angle. And only when there was an edge vertex at a weird angle did the ceiling jut out. So those are the 2 main ingredients. Now let's look at the situation from the side. So, consider the box again. Let's put it sideways and take the cross-section of it. As we saw in the previous demonstration, there's some geometry that can cause these 2 points to be misaligned, meaning the wall triangle can end up slanted. So just like last time, we're going to look at 5 different alignments of the upper point. But this time, instead of checking whether 2 floors completely cover at the bounds, we're checking whether 1 floor completely covers the ceiling. So let's start with the wall being perfectly vertical. In this case, the edge of the floor is exactly flush with the edge of the ceiling. If we show the hitboxes, we can see that the floor completely covers the ceiling hitbox. Since none of the ceiling leaks through, it doesn't cause any invisible walls. So I'll give this case a happy face. Then next, let's look at leaning very far back. Here, the wall triangle is so slanted that it's now a ceiling. So that's an extra ceiling that the floor now needs to cover. But if we show the hitboxes, we can see that the floor does cover both ceilings completely. So this case gets a happy face. Then next, let's look at leaning a little back. Here, the wall triangle is still a wall, just a slightly leaning wall. If we show the hitboxes again, we can see that the floor still covers the whole ceiling, this time with a little bit of floor to spare. So this case gets a happy face. Then next, let's skip ahead and look at leaning very far forwards. Here, the wall triangle is so slanted the other way that it's now a floor. If we show the hitboxes, we can see that the 2 floors together cover all of the ceiling. Like, the original floor no longer covers the whole ceiling because its left edge is to the right of the ceiling's left edge. But fortunately, the new floor is there
anyone
to
but
pick up
Levi
the
is
slack
good.
and cover them. So this case gets a happy face. Finally, let's look at leaning a little forwards. Here, the wall triangle is still a wall, just a slightly leaning wall. Now let's show the hitboxes. You can see that in this case, some of the ceiling leaks through the
Cool, we
leaning
got
wall,
life loss
because
now.
walls don't cover ceiling hitboxes.
It's literally life
Just like I
lost.
said earlier, walls that lean slightly forwards are taking on the responsibility of a floor, but without the powers of a floor. So I'm going to give this case an angry face. So to recap, we looked at 5 slants, and only a wall that's leaning slightly forwards lets ceiling hitbox leak through. And if we move the upper vertex around continuously, you can see that it's only a very narrow range that lets the ceiling leak through. Specifically, the wall triangle has to be leaning forwards so that the ceiling juts out more than the floor, but the wall can't be leaning too far forwards or else it acts as a floor that covers that distance. And finally, let's look at the side view and the top-down view at the same time. When the wall leans very far back, the fill is just a uniform shade of purple, so no ceiling leaks. When the wall leans a little back, we see some blue, meaning the floor juts out more than the ceiling. But that doesn't cause any trouble. When the wall's perfectly vertical, it's also a uniform shade of purple, which is fine. When the wall leans a little forwards, now we see some red, meaning the ceiling juts out more than the floor, so some ceiling might be leaking through the leaning wall. And when the wall leans very far forwards, then the wall becomes a floor that covers the ceiling hitbox. So it's once again a uniform shade of purple, which is fine. And so, it's only the one case where ceiling leaks through. And let me clarify something. Last time, we looked at floor gaps, which actually had 3 different subcases. It could be a floor gap with a floor under it, a floor gap that lets out of bounds leak through, or a floor gap that lets ceiling leak through. But this time, there's just one case. When the ceiling juts out, ceiling leaks through. So I just wanted to clarify that bit of asymmetry.
Damn.
And so now, let's look at some examples. In Bob on Battlefield, we have this gray tunnel. Here's the wall, and you can see that the edges at the top and bottom of the wall are subdivided differently, which causes there to be edge vertices. So let's go to a top-down view, show the floors on the top of the tunnel, and you can see that on the underside of the tunnel, we have some ceilings. So let's add those to our map as well. Now we're going to zoom in on each edge vertex. On all 4 of these edge vertices, you can see some red area, meaning the ceiling juts out more than the floor. And so the result is that all along this edge, there are ceiling units with no floor to cover them, resulting in an invisible wall. But we can't forget about the other side of the tunnel, because here we have something very similar going on. Another 4 edge vertices. But will the ceiling jut out or the floor jut out? Let's see. First the ceiling juts out, then the floor juts out, then the ceiling juts out, then the floor juts out. So interestingly, we actually end up with only 2 ceiling units of invisible wall, one at each of the 2 vertices where the ceiling jutted out. So that's a cool thing about this type of invisible wall. Sometimes there will just be a single unit column sticking out right at the ceiling vertex itself. And now I'll show you another cool thing you can do with invisible walls, walking in midair, then downwarp it. So how does that work? Well, let me explain. So as you know, Mario's movement consists of him moving using quarter steps. Now, the quarter step function in the code has a return value. And basically think of the return value as the status for how the quarter step went. In total, there are 4 possible values that can be returned. First, the movement succeeded. This is basically the default value and means nothing unexpected happened. Second, Mario became airborne. This happens when you leave the ground. Third, the movement got cancelled, either because Mario moved into a ceiling or out of bounds. And fourth, Mario hit a wall, which happens when Mario hits a wall. Now the quarter step function can only return one of these values, so even if it seems like multiple things happened, the function just has to pick one and return it. So for example, let's say we have a setup like this and Mario does a quarter step. This quarter step both leaves the ground and moves into a ceiling that cancels the step. The function can't return both that Mario became airborne and the movement got cancelled, so it just has to pick one. And in this case, it picks that the movement got cancelled. That one takes priority. So what happens here is that the movement gets cancelled and Mario ends up pushing in place. He does not become airborne. Here's what that looks like in the game. Mario's movement gets cancelled even though the quarter step goes off the edge. But now consider this. Let's say Mario's walking into a ceiling and then suddenly the floor moves out from under him. You'd think he would fall down, but that's not what happens. He's actually able to stay in the air walking into the ceiling. See, the normal way that the game realizes that Mario is airborne is by checking the return value of the quarter step function and seeing if it's the airborne option. But as we just established, if Mario walks into a ceiling and the air at the same time, then the quarter step function just returns that the movement got cancelled, not that Mario became airborne. So at no point does the game realize that Mario should become airborne, and instead he's just allowed to continue moving into the ceiling in midair. An easy place to see this is on this elevator in Big Boo's Haunt. We can walk into the ceiling next to the elevator, and then Mario stays in place pushing even as the elevator moves away. Now when you're in this state, there are a few things you can do. You can press A to jump out of it,
I meant
you
to
can
use
press B
Bombard.
to punch in place, and you can press C, which downwarps you to the ground while crouching. Why does it downwarp you? Well, when you press C while you're moving, you go into the crouch sliding action. Now, an interesting thing about the sliding actions is that they tilt Mario based on the floors around him. See, even though Mario's on a flat floor, the sliding action causes him to tilt based on that hill next to him. Here's the function in the code responsible for setting that tilt, but you can see that the first thing this function does is set Mario's height to be at the height of the floor below him. So that means every time you slide and get your tilt set, you're also being snapped to the floor below you. More specifically, this floor snap happens on every frame except if your last quarter step became airborne. You know, because they didn't want you to get a big downwarp when you slide off the edge. So let's say you're in midair and you're walking into the ceiling. Then you press C to crouch slide into the ceiling. The first quarter step of the crouch slide enters the ceiling hitbox and gets cancelled. So the return value of that quarter step is that it got cancelled, not that it became airborne. And like I said, any sliding movement that doesn't become airborne aligns Mario with the ground. And so he gets a big downwarp to the floor below him. So that's how the downwarp works in Big Boo's Haunt. So this mostly explains how I downwarped earlier. I walked into a ceiling in midair and then pressed Z. But how did I initiate walking in midair without standing on a platform that moves out from under me? Well, it has to do with the turning around action. See, when Mario starts turning around, he goes into the turning
Oh
around.
my god, this is
And
crazy!
later, he transitions into the walking action. You know, because he finished turning around. Here's the code for the turning around action. Here's the relevant logic. So if Mario's done turning around, specifically if the turning around animation is completed, then Mario goes into the walking action. Now a bit earlier, we have some other important code. This one says, if the quarter steps result in becoming airborne, then Mario goes into the free fall action. So you can see the issue. Let's say on the same frame, Mario both leaves the ground and finishes turning around. Then first his action gets set to free fall, and then second his action gets set to walking. So that first action change gets overridden by the second action change. And so even though Mario left the ground, he still ends up in the walking action. Now this exploit by itself just results in one frame of walking in the air before transitioning to free fall on the next frame. But let's say we use that one frame of walking in the air to walk into out of bounds. Now Mario stays walking in midair and can downwarp by pressing Z. We can also use that one frame of walking in the air to walk into a ceiling, which also lets us downwarp. Now since invisible walls are made of out of bounds ceilings, we can also do the trick on them by walking in midair and then pressing Z to downwarp. So let me summarize everything. I did a turnaround and then walked off the edge on the same frame that the turnaround ended. That first set my action to free fall, but then overrode it with the walking action. So I was in midair, but still in the walking action. Then I walked into the invisible wall, so the quarter step return value was that the quarter step got cancelled, not that I left the ground. Because of that, the game didn't know that I should have become airborne, and so it just let me walk in midair. And finally, I pressed Z to downward because the crouch sliding action aligns Mario with his floor if it doesn't become airborne. And here, it didn't become airborne, it got cancelled because it crouch slid into the invisible wall. So a lot going on there, but that's how you can downwarp on basically any invisible wall. Then still in Bob on Battlefield, we have this wall on the mountain. This is the wall with the lower alcove. Now, there's one triangle on the wall that's actually classified as the ceiling. So, let's mark that ceiling's edges as well. So that gives us 4 edge vertices. And as you can see, all 4 of them in the ceiling jut out more than the floor. So that means both on the ceiling of the alcove and along that little extra ceiling, we have ceiling columns leaking through. Luckily, none of them block the entrance of the alcove itself. But if you're on top of the mountain, you could hit this invisible wall if you try to cross above this edge. Then right above that previous wall, we have this wall on the mountain. This is the wall with the upper alcove, which if you remember, already had an invisible wall in it. anyway, we have 4 edge vertices on the ceiling of the alcove. So let's see. Floor juts out, floor juts out, ceiling juts out, ceiling juts out. So basically, just on the right side of the alcove ceiling, we have some ceiling columns leaking through. So you could hit these if you try to travel above the alcove. Now, speedrunners actually come out of that upper alcove and side flip up to King Bob-omb, potentially going right through the invisible wall. So if you ever try that side flip and you only managed to ledge grab, you probably got blocked by that invisible wall. Then in Jolly Roger Bay, we have this wall on the sunken ship. The wall is a diamond shape, so it has 2 edge vertices, one at the top corner and one at the bottom corner. You can see that both edge vertices let the ceiling jut out, and it juts out by a lot. So once again, we have a really thick invisible wall. Now this is our first invisible wall that stems from surface triangles on an object, because the sunken ship is an object and not just static geometry. And the thing about objects is that they're only tangible when Mario's within a certain radius around them. For example, if you're standing on an object and you jump up too high, you may notice your shadow change positions. That's because when you jump up too high, you move out of the object's tangibility radius, and so the object stops being tangible. In other words, the object stops loading its surface triangles, and so your shadow drops from on top of the object to just on top of the ground. So let's go back to the sunken ship. The invisible walls here stem from the ship's ceiling triangles. In other words, these invisible walls only exist when the ship's surface triangles are loaded, and that only happens when Mario is within this radius around the ship. So if Mario's outside of that radius, the ship won't have any surface triangles, and so effectively there are no invisible walls outside of the radius. And so going forward, all invisible walls stemming from object triangles will have their height capped at the object's tangibility radius. So here, you can see that if we swim above the invisible wall, nothing happens, since the ship is intangible when we're this far away from it. But if we swim a little lower down into the invisible wall, then the ceiling triangles are loaded and affect Mario, causing him to downward. Because remember, when you're in water, ceiling hitboxes downward view to the bottom of their hitbox.
What the what? What just happened? What just happened?
Then in Cool Mountain, we have this wall on the side of this snowy bridge. It's just a triangle, so it has one edge vertex on the bottom. If we zoom in, you can see that the ceiling juts out, meaning we have ceiling columns all along this edge. And I really like the way this one looks. It's very aesthetically pleasing. But anyway, if you're sliding down this path, be wary of jumping off to the right side here. Then still in Cool Mountain, we have this wall near the wall cakes will work area. It has one edge vertex on the top, and when we zoom in, you can see that the ceiling juts out. So we have a decently thick invisible wall, which thins out farther away from the ledge. Now you might think, who would ever run into this invisible wall? Like, you're not just gonna jump off the edge right there, right? Well, not exactly. See, speedrunners jump down that way to get to the wall cakes will work star. So let's take a look at some past attempts.
What? How am I standing here?
Thank you for tuning in.
Oh. Mario? What the fuck? Oh my.
Vanish. Thank you for tuning in.
What's going on with those? Mario's doing some weird animations. Well, let me explain. Firstly, when Mario's on a steep floor, he slides down. You can even slide into ceilings and out of bounds, in which case your movement gets cancelled and you just stay sliding in place. Note that when you're sliding, you can use the control stick to tilt Mario's upper body. Now, usually when you're in a sliding action, your animation updates every frame to be the sliding animation. But there's an oversight in the sliding mode, because if you're sliding and your movement gets cancelled, either from moving into a ceiling or out of bounds, then Mario's animation doesn't get set to the sliding animation. Instead, you just keep whatever animation you're already in. I mean, here, I was already in the sliding animation when I started sliding into out of bounds, so I kept that sliding animation. But let me demonstrate it with a different animation. Here, I do the pushing animation, and then start sliding into out of bounds. The sliding into out of bounds doesn't update Mario's animation, and so his animation stays as pushing, even though he's actually sliding. And when you're in this state, you can still use the control stick to tilt Mario's upper body. So going back to Cool Mountain, you can see that the invisible wall here is right next to a steep floor that makes you slide. So we can use the invisible wall to let us slide in place with various other animations. For example, here I slide in place in the backflipping animation. So it doesn't even look like Mario landed yet, even though it's actually on the ground sliding. Here I slide in the jumping animation, and remember, I can still tilt Mario's upper body, which looks pretty funny in this animation. It definitely wasn't intended to handle that. Here I slide in the walking animation. This one also looks pretty silly when you tilt it, especially because he's just running in place. Where are you trying to get to, Mario? Trying to go somewhere? Oh, almost got there. Come on, Mario. Do it. Oh, almost there. Come on, a little more. Oh, there we go. Here I do a triple jump into it, so I slide in the triple jump animation. And here I slide in the sparkly triple jump animation, which results in Mario somersaulting for forever. So yeah, it's fun to play around with. In Hazy Maze Cave, we have this wall on this little floating structure. It has two edge vertices on the bottom. So will the floor jut out or the ceiling jut out? On this first vertex, actually neither one juts out. They're exactly aligned. So give it up for the programmers, guys. They made an edge vertex that exactly lies on its edge. No one thought it could be done, but here we are. Well, to be fair, this edge is at a 45-degree angle, so not exactly a weird angle. And then for the other edge vertex, the ceiling juts out. So actually, that results in just one ceiling column of invisible wall, right at the vertex itself. But then there's also the other side of the structure, which is like a mirror image of the first side. So we have two edge vertices, one of them lines up exactly, and the other one lets the ceiling jut out.
The E
So on this side
team.
too, we have
I just
another
realized I
ceiling
finally
column
know
by
why they
itself.
call it
So
the
I actually
E
don't know if
team.
anyone's ever hit
Because
these ones
everyone's
before.
name
If you
starts
know
at the
what
letter
area is,
E.
then leave a comment.
11. Even though the E in her name is silent, her name still starts with an E. And then we got Eve and Emperor. E team. Anyway, I want healing, but
Keep going ahead.
I wanted
and you'll
healing,
see
but
the
Emperor
gates
is
of
good.
hell.
Emperor is great. Emperor is fantastic.
Or to bid farewell to me.
Because you will get burned if you mess up. And in Snowman's Land, we have this wall on the ledge with the tree. It has one edge vertex on the bottom. Now this one's also a hybrid in a sense, because on the left we have a floor gap with ceiling leaking through, and on the right we have the ceiling jutting out more than the floor does. So that means all along this edge there are ceiling columns leaking through. So if you're ever climbing up the snowman, then you randomly have your height cut short or bombed while you're crossing this edge.
Do you want my
and
marks?
And still in Snowman's Land, we have this section near the top of the snowman. This one's a little weird because it doesn't involve a wall. Instead, to the left we have a ceiling. So let's mark the ceiling's edge. And to the right, we have the floor. So let's mark the floor's edge. And so basically, the edge vertex is here because the floor vertex is meant to lie on the ceiling's edge. And the edge vertex misses, which means that farther to the right, we have the ceiling jutting out more than the floor. And so all along this edge, we have some invisible wall from the ceiling one get in your way if you try cutting it across the corner while climbing the snowman. But also, this invisible wall is next to a floor so steep that you can't stand on it or slide on it. You just fall off of it. So a cool thing you can do is wedge Mario between the floor and the invisible wall, and he just kind of gets stuck there in the falling animation.
Oh.
But it is possible to get at them.
What's going on? What? I've never seen that. What?
And in Tall Mountain, we have this wall near the rolling log. See, there's a reason I picked this place to use in the intro, and it's because there's so many invisible walls around here that I think most people would relate to bumping into one of them. We also have one on this wall, except for on the left without a wall. We actually have two different edge vertices here, which both miss the edge. That means to the left, we have some invisible walls.
Oh, I didn't mean to. Oh, it actually only costs 2. Oh my god, I'm such a fucking idiot.
I will read your mind and go.
But the left edge vertex misses in a way that both makes a floor gap with ceiling units and also lets the ceiling jut out. So yet another hybrid.
Away from
Yeah,
me.
this area is even more hazardous than you think. More invisible walls
Thank
than
you
you
for
worry
tuning in.
about. There's actually one more invisible
Go.
wall around here, but we're not going to get around to that one until the beginning. So stay tuned for that. What the fuck was that?
Thank you for tuning in. Vanish.
Oh my god.
Our misfortune has finally ended.
Still in Tall Mountain, at the top of the waterfall, we have these two walls. It's another alcove, and alcoves seem to be basically as bad as stairs are. But anyway, we have two edge vertices, and they both let the ceiling jut out. So along both ceiling edges, we have some invisible wall, though it's much more concentrated on the left side than it is on the right side. So basically, if you try to enter the alcove from above, you might get blocked by this invisible wall. And then the Tall Mountain slide is the first arch. Remember when I said the first arch was fine because it had a floor on top?
Malaria.
Arches? Well, turns out it does have some invisible walls. We just weren't ready for them back then. But you can see that its shape creates a ton of edge vertices, so it's almost guaranteed that some of them will let ceiling leak out. And then there's also the other side of the arch. Not actually a wall on this side, but I'm still drawing a theoretical wall just to help you see the shape of the arch. So on this side too,
Whoa, that was-
a bunch of
I
edge
almost
vertices,
accidentally-
some of which let ceiling leak through. And the invisible wall on this side is basically a mirror image of the invisible wall on the other side. But while you can go on top of the first arch,
Now we have a healer.
there's still some invisible walls to worry about.
I'm so glad that you brought me to this grand feast.
At the bottom, the ceiling jut out, so we have some invisible wall to the right of the edge vertex. But we're actually not done yet, because on this wall too, we have something going on. Two more edge vertices that both let ceiling jut out, so we have some invisible wall on this edge too. So I guess if you ever wanted to just jump off one of these two edges, then these invisible walls could get in your way. Or just think of them as guardrails keeping you on for your own safety. And in the tiny version of Tiny Huge Island, we have basically the same thing. Well, only for the first invisible wall. The second invisible wall actually isn't present at all here.
At last,
This one
we meet
is
again.
one more invisible wall that
Soida
you
is
have
the
to worry
name of this
about.
flower.
And then TikTok Clock, we have this wall on, guessed it, or stairs. So that's three edge vertices. The outer two line up exactly, but the middle one lets the ceiling jut out. Just near that middle vertex, we have some invisible wall, specifically on the first and second steps. But then we also have the other side of the stairs. Note that the wall on this side doesn't include the upper two steps, because the wall for those two steps is a bit further out in order to be flush with the treadmill. That means we just have two edge vertices. One of them lines up exactly, and the other one lets the ceiling jut out. So on this side of the stairs, we have some invisible wall just on the first step. And so these invisible walls are pretty bad, because they might kill you on the very first jump in the level, a couple seconds in.
Was absolutely everywhere. Like literally.
And since TikTok Clock is a vertical stage, that means invisible walls here have a much greater impact, because now the invisible wall can affect the later parts of the level too. This invisible wall goes all the way up until it meets this walkway, but more importantly, in the middle of this gap you have to jump over, where sometimes it gets cut off a bit by this rotating triangle. That means anytime you jump over this gap, you have to worry about this invisible wall. And walking in TikTok Clock usually leads to falling way far down, often with dire consequences. So it's pretty unfortunate for speedrunners, but that's just the way it is. Runners will also try to jump from this cog into the get a hand start, which goes right through this invisible wall, so you could easily bonk during that jump too.
Alright, so I can do it here, there's no invisible.
What?
Go.
I've never seen this before.
Go. Away from me.
It's this wall, really?
Thank you for tuning in. I will read your mind and everything else. I will read your mind and everything else. I will see through your soul.
That same area, we have this wall on the treadmill. Because of the way the floor slopes down on both sides,
Face your fear head on.
the left one has the floor jut out, and the right one has the ceiling jut out. So primarily on the right side, you get some invisible wall. But not above the last two stairs, because they will enter the treadmill and block the
Misalignment.
invisible wall from coming out. Now luckily, this invisible wall doesn't extend up too high from an object, but it can still lead to your death if you hit it just right.
The contorted faces and terrified
Small
screams are truly
area, kind of a
irresistible.
weird shape, but it has 3 edge vertices. So let's see. First the ceiling juts out, then they're exactly aligned, then the ceiling juts out. Consequently, we have ceiling columns all along the edge. But you may notice that there's a single gap in the invisible wall. It's right at the vertex that was exactly aligned. But basically, that means that anytime you jump over to this area, you risk bonking and falling all the way down to your death. Definitely not a very fair system.
How long is this?
I said an invisible wall there.
Hey, now you know why. Now this invisible wall also extends pretty high up in the level. You can see some of it stops at this walkway, but then the rest of it rises up all the way to the ceiling of the course. So yeah, this one can be pretty annoying given how far-reaching it is in the level. Specifically, it passes by 2 walkways. For this lower walkway, if you try to take a shortcut by jumping across the gap, you may bonk and fall down to your death.
That is the saddest thing. No! Clearly, this is clearly, it's not the rod! Clearly! Jesus fuck!
And for the upper walkway, if you try to jump down, as speedrunners do, you could definitely hit the invisible wall.
Welcome! Only 100,000.
Someone help me, man. Jesus Christ.
This one actually has a solution. See, you can go forwards on top of the clock hand because it creates a little safe haven above it. It's like Moses parting the Red Sea, but it's the clock hand parting the invisible wall. Even still on TikTok clock, we have these 3 treadmills. Now the treadmills themselves are cardinally aligned, so there's no issue with them. But focus your attention on these mesh walls between the treadmills.
60 energy, that's overkill.
So if we look at them, you can see that they're 3D shapes. It's just that normally you only see the texture for one side of them. Now on the bottom of these boxes, we have ceilings. So the question is, do the ceiling hitboxes leak out? See, the boxes don't have floors on their tops. Instead, they rely solely on the treadmill floors to cover them. So let's see how well that plays out. For this first seam, it's a 1 unit wide gap between the treadmills. Consequently, you can see some red area, so you may think some ceiling leaks through. But actually, every integer coordinate is covered by a floor, so all the ceiling is covered. Now let's take a look at the other seam. Between these 2 treadmills, there's a 2 unit wide gap. So this time, we do have integer coordinates that are ceiling with no floor to cover them. This gives us a 1 unit thick continuous seam of invisible wall between those 2 treadmills. And so as you're climbing from the second treadmill to the third treadmill, you might hit this invisible wall. That's not actually the full story here. Remember what I said, the boxes have ceilings on the bottom, no floors on the top, so they rely on the treadmill floors to cover the ceiling. But the treadmills are objects, meaning that they're only tangible when Mario's near them. So it probably wasn't a very good idea to cover the ceilings with floors that are only sometimes there. I'll illustrate what I mean with a diagram. So here are the 3 treadmills, here's the upper box, and here's the lower box. Now we're actually going to subdivide both boxes into 2 chunks. So both boxes have a right chunk and a left chunk. Next, let's add the ceilings on the bottom of the boxes. Now we're going to go through the 4 chunks to see what each of their ceiling hitboxes look like. But first, let's do the right chunk of the lower box. In isolation, its ceiling hitbox looks like this, but this chunk is covered by the lower treadmill. Mario's radius around the treadmill will have 2 floors to cover the ceiling, so there's no invisible wall within that radius. But the invisible wall is there when Mario's outside of the radius. And next, let's look at the left chunk of the lower box. In isolation, its ceiling box looks like this, but this chunk is covered by the middle treadmill. So if Mario is within this radius, then the treadmill has its floors until there's no invisible wall within that radius, but it is there outside of the radius. Next, let's look at the right chunk of the
It's
upper
time
box.
for the
So
toys
it's not
to
covered
meet
by
and
any
thank you
treadmill,
for
so
your
the
warm
ceiling hitbox is
invitation.
exposed. And finally, let's look at the left chunk of the upper box. In isolation, its ceiling hitbox looks like this, but this chunk is covered by the upper treadmill.
Oh,
Mario's
those who
within
are
this radius,
lost,
then the treadmill
get
has
in
its
line
floors,
if you want
and
to
so
have
there's
your
no
fortune
invisible
read.
wall within that radius, but it is there outside of the radius. And so now you can see the nature of these invisible walls. Specifically, we have 4 separate chunks of them. One of them is fully exposed, and the other 3 exist only outside of the tangibility radius of the corresponding treadmill. Now I'll show what these invisible walls look like in the game. We have the right chunk of the lower box, the left chunk of the box, the right chunk of the upper box, the left chunk of the upper box. So yeah, this is the true nature of these invisible walls. So you can see that the lower invisible wall rise up upward, while the upper invisible rise up all the way to the ceiling of the floors. So even
The
if
hell
the
is
first
this?
and second treadmill, there's still the possibility of walking if you jump up high enough. And because the upper invisible wall rises all the way to the top, it can get in your way if you try to long jump from the clock hand over to the clock. And remember, it's not just a single seam of invisible wall, it's a whole box area's worth. So there's really no chance of you getting lucky and passing right through it, like you could with many of the other invisible walls. And then one more tick on the clock, we have this wall on the uppermost treadmill. Just like the first treadmill, it has 2 edge vertices on the top. When we zoom in, you can see that the right one lets the ceiling jut out, the left one is exactly aligned. Just on this side of the treadmill, we use some invisible wall. And remember, because these invisible wall units stem from an object, you have to play at the object's tangibility radius. So even at the very top of the cut block, there's this final invisible wall to worry about. In Rainbow Ride, we're back to the ship.
Go.
This wall on the ship's outside, which has 1 edge vertex on the bottom. And then the edge vertex missing by 2 units, even though the edge was cardinally aligned. The wall is 2 units thick right at the edge vertex, and everywhere else is a 1 unit thick continuous seam. So if you try long jumping onto that part of the ship, this invisible wall could lead to your death.
Thank you for tuning in.
Both on the uppermost platform, this wall has 1 edge vertex on the bottom. Now this one's another hybrid wall. To the right, we have the ceiling shut out more than the floor. But we have a floor gap that might
At long last,
so we end up with some out of
my
bounds,
soul
some
is
ceiling,
freed.
both stemming from the same misaligned edge vertex. Then we have something similar going
I
on
smell
the
the
second
sweet
platform.
fragrance
By
of
similar, I mean
souls.
exactly the same thing. The edge vertex also causes a hybrid. Some out of bounds, some ceiling.
Bruh,
Not that yet, because the third platform also has a hybrid.
this is crazy.
On the other side,
Go.
so you might be wondering, how many of these platforms are going to have oh, so we're on the
I
4th
smell
platform
the
right
sweet
now.
fragrance
There are only
of
7 platforms
souls.
total. So why don't you take a guess? at
I
how
didn't
many
think this through very well.
right now we're seeing the 5th platform is invisible. The 6th platform also has an invisible wall. 6%, you're better for the last one.
talking.
And the 7th platform also has an invisible wall. This time on the other side. You believe
Bro,
that
why do people keep spawning here? It didn't look like a freaking enemy spawner.
time to traverse this area. A
I
whole gauntlet
can't
of invisible
go
walls.
down
You thought the
this.
challenge was to
I'm just dead.
point out some
It's game over.
platforms.
It's Jover.
Additional secret challenges.
Finally,
So hope you get lucky on every
we
platform.
are reunited.
And speedrunners will do a triple jump on the 7th platform in order to get onto the railing, which goes right through that last hole.
We'll start again from scratch.
Oh no.
Oh, cool, I can keep on.
What? What the? What?
Well, that was awful.
Oh, okay. Alright, moving right along. And then finally, we have this wall in the castle foyer. Factoring in the hole for the door, it has 3 edge vertices. Zooming in, we have exactly aligned, and the ceiling juts out. So that means mainly on the right side of the door opening, the ceiling leaking through. So you might just be going through the foyer to your next course, and then bam, you hit this invisible wall. So not even the foyer is safe. That's the 6th cause of invisible walls, which we're going to call ceiling juts out due to misaligned edge vertex. So now, let's look at the 7th cause. So remember that picture we had before, where it was just a regular old box? Let's look at it from above again. Remember, when this structure rotated, the floor edge and ceiling edge stayed perfectly flush without letting any ceiling leak through. But now focus your attention on this vertex of the ceiling. If we move this vertex to a slightly different spot, then it can make the ceiling jut out. And if we do our little process, we can see that some units are ceilinged with no floor to cover them. So those ceiling units leak through the leading wall and cause invisible walls. So once again, there are cases where the programmers literally just didn't line up 2 vertices that could have been lined up. In this case, it's a floor vertex and a ceiling vertex that aren't lined up, allowing some ceiling to leak through. So let's look at some examples. Bob on Battlefield, we have these 2 walls on the mountain, on the ridge with the spinning heart. Based on their edges, they connect at this vertex. So will the floor vertex and ceiling vertex line up? Nope. The ceiling vertex misses by 1 unit and causes ceiling to jut out on both walls. So we end up with invisible wall on both of these edges. So this is just 1 more invisible wall on the mountain that you have to worry about. And in Monk's Fortress, we have this wall on the axle connected.
Have you gotten some rest today? Cramming too much work into your schedule takes a toll on your health.
See that the floor vertex and ceiling vertex are 1 unit off, so the ceiling juts out on the head. So it results in 3 units of ceiling leaking.
honey.
But nevertheless, it's still a potential thing that can make you bonk out of nowhere at this level. And in Cool Mountain, we have this wall in the bulk explored area. This time, the floor vertex and ceiling vertex leak quite a bit. So all along this wall, we end up with ceiling units leaking through. So this is the 2nd wall that we've seen here in the wall explored area. Remember, speedrunners go through that spot as they make their way to the start, so it's extra bad for speedrunners.
Debugging completed. I can go even further now.
See that? It's a wall? Oh, I never seen this.
And in Snowman's Land, we have this wall on the snowman. And let's also mark this floor edge next to it, because that also
Debugging
connects to the
completed.
vertex we're about to look at.
I can go even further now.
And the floor vertex misses the ceiling vertex by 1 unit. So on the left, we have a floor gap with ceiling coming out, and on the right, we have the ceiling jutting out more than the floor. So another hybrid case. And earlier, we had another wall right around here. So I guess this part of the snowman wasn't put